Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Cybersecurity Weekly. I'm Fred Cobb, and today I have Chad Waddell with me. Chad is our senior cyber architect and works with our security division within cyber services at Infosystems. And Chad, today we're going to talk about patching. I know that is the bane of a lot of IT operators when it comes down to this idea of having to constantly patch. What's all this patching about?
Right.
But we really need to talk about how important it is from a cybersecurity perspective to get the word out, just how important patching is, how you need to have a good patching regimen. And if you don't patch, some of the exposure that you put your company in as it relates to cyber attacks. So just what's up with all this patching? Can you elaborate on that just a little bit?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me on the podcast and to discuss these topics that are, important to Infosystems, important to me, important to you. But yeah, patching is something that every organization should be doing. They may already have some automatic patching that's going on already, but it's important for them to ensure that they patch across the board. And the reason for that is there's a lot of vulnerabilities in the software that we use. So if it's like your operating systems that you run, or if it's like the software that you utilize day in, day out, like let's say Microsoft Office, all software has some kind of vulnerabilities in it. And when we're talking about patches, typically in security patches more specifically, we're referring to the software that you install in a system that will fix some type of vulnerability on that system. And if there's a patch release for it, that means it's well known, at least to the manufacturer, the OEM, that there is that vulnerability and they've taken measures to fix it. So it's very important that you take the next step to install that patch.
Mm-hmm. If you think about it, when you think about patching as it relates to software code, it's impossible to create, well, virtually impossible, to create a piece of software that would be considered never needing to be patched, especially patching or software that's out there in the consumer space. Because you have to think about the backwards compatibility that has to be in the software as new releases of operating systems are coming out or new releases of applications are coming out. You're carrying forward some legacy code throughout even the next release of the operating system. Hence the reason why the patches are still so prevalent. So could you talk a little bit about the frequency of the patching? Let's take Microsoft as an example. So the Patch Tuesday piece.
Yeah, so Microsoft has what they call Patch Tuesday. And so every month, it's the second Tuesday of every month that they release all the new patches for their operating systems. They might also release some other patches for other software as well, but mainly the focus is on the Windows operating system. And like you touched on, Fred, with the legacy for, like, let's say Windows, for example, for an operating system, is you're bringing forward a lot of this old code and a lot of this in order to have this old compatibility for older operating systems and software. You're kind of bringing forward some of the problems that they had before. And often a lot of these patches, they're not just for, like, let's say Windows 10, they're also for older versions of Windows as well. So it's a patch that's released from multiple versions because it affects each of those, because it's something that not only exists in a previous version but in the newer versions as well. So some newer operating systems may just by default already deal with the patches and security issues that were in previous versions. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes it's a patch that's found across all of them. So the cadence is typically monthly. You've got those patches that are released. And so Patch Tuesday is very important from a manageability perspective for your environment and a security perspective. Going back to what we discussed just a moment ago, that if these patches are released, they're released for a very good reason. It's very well known. And even if it was just known the day it was released, now everyone's aware of it. So those bad actors are going to reverse engineer it, or they're already exploiting it out in the wild. So as long as you install that patch, you're going to prevent them from using that low-hanging fruit to potentially exploit your systems.
Yeah, there have been some real horror stories out in the IT community as a result of not patching appropriately. I can think of a couple of very well-known situations where data was breached. If you look at Heartland is a big payment processor, and they had over 130 million records that got into the wild as a result of a poorly patched system. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. I've seen statistics where 60 to 70% of problems that relate to external threat are a result of not patching systems appropriately. So let's talk for a minute about the anatomy of that. So you've got a vulnerability, you've got an exploit, then you've got a payload. Can you sort of put those in
Right.
the proper alignment and talk through how missing a patch could lead to a compromise of your systems.
Yeah, so for example, let's say you have a Windows system. So we're focusing on Windows a lot here because it's just so commonly used. If that same Windows system, let's say it's a server even, and it's touching the internet, so it's like a web server. So a good example would be like Equifax had a server. It wasn't necessarily Windows, but it was touching the internet, so anyone could get access to it through anywhere in the world potentially. And if there's some kind of vulnerability that is identified in whatever that web server is or software they use, it could be easily exploited from potentially anywhere in the world. If they didn't install the patch, so I'll use an example of the Equifax breach. So there's Apache Strut software that was used. They had missed a patch that was released, I believe it was like 30 or 90 days prior. So they didn't patch that, so it was exploited externally into their environment, and the bad actors were in there for a long period of time. So whenever we talk about vulnerabilities, an exploit is something that's used to basically take advantage of that vulnerability, to be able to break into that system. So it's very important that you get rid of all those low-hanging fruit that exist out there for the bad actors to take advantage of. Patching is really like one of the easiest ways to reduce your overall risk.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if you think about it, so you've got a piece of vulnerable software. Let's say that it's not patched. So then you've got a nefarious person out there that's intent on taking that vulnerability and doing something either to gain access to a system for monetary reasons or just to, for braggers' rights,
Right.
Whatever the impetus might be to want to attack a system. So you take the missing patch, you have the exploit. Exploit is basically the vehicle for delivering something nefarious, such as maybe some malware, maybe some ransomware, something bad.
Yeah, the entry point.
So the exploit becomes the way to gain access. Then the payload essentially is the bad piece of code that gets placed onto the system or some other means of attacking that particular device or that particular network. So, in fact, when Microsoft, and we're going to talk a little bit more with the time we have in regards to systems other than just Microsoft systems. We're going to talk about hardware patching as well. But if you think about the idea that I have this missing patch and it is exploited, what can I do as a administrator, a cyber expert? What can I do to really force the issue within the company? So we have systems that are, I'm going to give you an example. We have a manufacturing environment. It simply can't be down. So how do you take the time to patch a system on a monthly basis?
We'll be back with the Cybersecurity Weekly podcast after we pause for this special message. Security analysts believe cyber attacks will continue to escalate throughout 2020 and are recommending that every company, regardless of industry or size, place immediate focus on cybersecurity training and the tools that will protect you from these attacks. Did you know that you can book a cybersecurity assessment right now with Fred Cobb's team of cybersecurity engineers at Infosystems? They will help you discover exactly where you are most vulnerable to a cyber attack and make recommendations on how to strengthen your defense in those areas. This is urgent. It's an issue that affects everyone in our community. Visit the Infosystems website at www.infosystems.biz to request your cybersecurity assessment. Now back to the podcast.
Yes, that's the challenge. Yeah. So like patching isn't easy. I mean, if you're talking about just one system, maybe that's somewhat easy to do depending on what the patch is and if there's downtime or whatever. But when you're talking about an entire environment, you're talking about all these disparate types of systems, workstations, servers. You mentioned other types of patches for maybe like, let's say network equipment. So like firewalls, switches, routers. You need to be thinking about all these different types of devices that exist out there. So you've got to attack them and approach them uniquely. And not all patches are created equally either. Some of them may not require any downtime. Some of them do require reboot or some downtime for the system. Also, some patches may deal with vulnerability that's not as high of a risk as others. So some patches come out, they may be rated at a critical vulnerability or high vulnerability, so those should be addressed immediately or as soon as possible. But some that are lower criticality, maybe you deal with those whenever you do install those more critical patches, so do it at the same time. So the way to address this, you really got to take it by case basis, depending on your environment. And ideally, you don't have just one system that does that one process or that mission critical use case in a warehouse or whatever it is. You want to have multiple systems ideally, so you have redundancy. So part of security, we talk about availability. So you want to have a scenario where you could take down a system, production can keep going, and then you patch that system, you bring it back up, and everything's good for however long a period of time you want to make sure that it's fine. Then you patch the other system to bring it down. So ideally, you have some redundancy there in your environment, and just taking down one system isn't going to just take everything down.
Yeah, that's key, having some redundancy.
Right.
Or just having to get regimented about scheduling those maintenance windows
Right.
to do the patching.
Right.
So so you got Patch Tuesday. Then you have Exploit Wednesday. So Exploit Wednesday is, hey, I'm a bad guy. I get information that Microsoft publishes. They release that information to the public,
Right.
talking about here's all our vulnerabilities and here are the patches for those vulnerabilities for this month. Well, I'm a hacker out there, and I'm like, oh, I didn't know about that vulnerability.
Right.
So now I have information that I could use to build an exploit kit, deliver a payload,
Right.
and take advantage of that patch. So it's really you have to let the information out there. So it's this constant race
Yes.
to get the vulnerabilities patched and stay ahead of bad guys as best you can. That's not always the case. With zero-day threats, you're not always out in front as a vendor such as Microsoft.
Right.
But it is it's something that they have to publish. They have to make the information available, and it's up to the IT professionals within your organization to get those patches in place.
Right.
And again, it's not just Microsoft. If you think about a firewall, it's got an operating system in it. If you think about a storage controller, they're running operating systems, or they're running microcode, or they're running some sort of software that's allowing that device to operate and function. So there's vulnerabilities that are exposed in those types of devices all the time as well. Or take a web browser.
Yeah.
Just this week, Firefox released a critical vulnerability, and it's very, on the CVSS scale, very high. So they're asking that you patch your web browser immediately.
Right.
So it's not just Microsoft that's
No,
dealing with
you're
these
right.
patches. So it's widespread across the industry.
And that's a common thing that gets missed, is that organizations will focus on, let's say, the Windows desktop systems or Windows servers, but then they don't think about their hypervisors, or they have Linux servers, or their networking equipment. That seems to take a back seat, or it's just never addressed at all, and they may not even be aware of it until there is some type of breach or something happens, and it turned out, well, your firewall hasn't been patched in 5 years. So, that's a major concern.
Right.
But yeah, like you mentioned, it's an arms race with this stuff. So you got people who are discovering the exploits, or the vulnerabilities, and then developing exploits for it. Let's say Microsoft does release a patch for a specific vulnerability. They put it out there so it addresses that issue. They may be putting that patch out there because it is well known that it's been exploited in the wild. It could be that it is a bit of a 0-day, or maybe Microsoft themselves has discovered it and they're putting a patch out there. But the bad actors, they can, like you said, they put the information out there. It's like a blueprint for them. They could reverse engineer that information, or they may get out there on the community and say, hey, has anyone figured out how to exploit this specific vulnerability? And then it's typically a short period of time between once the vulnerability has been identified and then when an exploit has been released. And your goal is you want to reduce that window of risk that would be between that time frame.
No, great information.
Yeah.
Chad, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks, Fred.
In an upcoming episode, we're going to take this idea of patching and take it a little bit further into end-of-life operating systems, talk about Windows 7, talk about Windows 2008, Exchange 2010. So stay tuned for that. I'm Fred Cobb. Thank you for joining. We appreciate you tuning in and look forward to seeing you again, Cybersecurity Weekly. Thanks.